We all love a tasty meal, but there's more going on than simple pleasure. It turns out our own bodies possess some pretty impressive biological tools for detecting what is in the things we eat and drink. And just as for ruminants, flavors inform our body wisdom. Welcome back to our podcast, Tasting Terroir, a journey that explores the link between healthy soil and the flavor of your food. I'm your host, Sarah Harper. That was an excerpt from my new favorite book, What Your Food Ate: How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health by David R. Montgomery and Anne Bikle. And truthfully, I cannot say enough about this book. It's great, especially for the topics that we're interested in on this podcast, the flavor of food, the link to soil health. We could do 10 episodes just on this book. And I'm excited to bring to you an in-depth interview with the authors of the book and my co-host, Dr. Jill Clapperton, in just a moment. But before we dive into that, I want to give you just a few excerpts from chapter 14 of the book, The Flavor of Health, because of course we are on the journey to find and talk about the link between soil health and the flavor of food. But it can often be difficult because the science is still emerging on flavor and that link. And Dave and Ann have helpfully included some of that science and put some framing around this topic that I think is particularly interesting. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from, again, chapter 14, Flavor of Health, and I'll give you some background on the authors, and then we will dive into our interview with them. Flavor and taste have always been means to an end. On the surface, they were how we identified and remembered sources of nourishing food and avoided toxins. But on a deeper level, flavor and taste guide us to health-imbuing nutrients and compounds. Just like that of our herds and flocks, our body wisdom developed a nutritional dossier through repeated exposure to different flavors. The agents that collect and help interpret all this intelligence are special cells, tucked deep inside the nose at the doorstep of the brain, along with taste receptors in the mouth. Another excerpt. Bland-tasting fruits and vegetables, it appears, contain fewer health protective compounds than those suffused with flavor. At least that's according to a 2006 study published in Science that analyzed hundreds of volatiles in tomatoes. It turned out that the volatiles linked to the most satisfying flavors are rooted in compounds that directly benefit human health, like carotenoids, phytochemicals essential for sound vision and eye health. The essential fatty acids LA and ALA contributed to the best-tasting tomatoes. In addition, 3 amino acids also underpinned mouth-watering flavors, and these particular amino acids are among those that our bodies cannot make. The only naturally occurring source of them is in the foods in one's diet. Another excerpt. It is challenging, if not impossible, to recreate the full nutritional profile of the whole foods from which ingredients for ultra-processed foods are sourced. But that is not the goal. Adding back the same phytochemicals and fats removed in processing would wreck the formulated textures, tastes, and flavors of ultra-processed foods. And they mentioned earlier that this category includes many of the fake meats and fake cheeses that you see on the shelves. Much easier is to begin with a blank slate pile of protein or carbs and add vitamins and minerals back into the final version of the food product, along with various flavorings, binders, additives, and preservatives. But whatever the final concoction, it is not a substitute for all that was lost along the way. Tastier foods are no longer a sure guide to healthier ones. Flooding ultra-processed foods with flavors may delight the tongue and brain for a moment, but it leaves the body wisdom to spin aimlessly like a needle of a broken compass, searching for north. That the health effects of diet are poorly understood through single components is borne out in research showing that combinations of various foods and spices can prove more important than the effects of any individual food or spice. For example, data from the Iowa Women's Health Study show that fiber left intact in whole grain foods reduced the risk of mortality more than an equivalent amount of fiber added back into refined grain foods. The benefit wasn't just from the fiber. Eating whole food sets up synergies between basic components like fats, fiber, and phytochemicals when they come naturally packaged together as a plant. And finally, Drinking polyphenol-rich wine along with meat is another way to get some phytochemicals in your diet. This food and drink combination was also found to greatly reduce blood levels of key markers for oxidative stress and inflammation related to heart disease. These effects are likely due to polyphenols inhibiting the oxidation of dietary fat and beta carotene. In simplifying our modern diet, we've stripped out things that formerly interacted to our benefit. Honestly, I could read the whole book to you. It's that good. I really can't recommend it enough. But you'll get to hear a lot more about it here in just a minute. Just a little more background on the book. David R. Montgomery and Ann Bikle take us far beyond the well-worn adage of, "Are you really what you eat?" to deliver a new truth. The roots of good health start on farms. Of course they do. What Your Food Ate marshals evidence from recent and forgotten science to illustrate how the health of the soil ripples through that of crops, livestock, and ultimately us. What they really do a great job of is explaining the soil microbiome and how it affects the health of plants, the flavor, and how agricultural practices affect those things too, in a way that is interesting and understandable. And you don't have to be a soil scientist to get it. So just a little background on the authors. David R. Montgomery is a professor at the University of Washington and a MacArthur Fellow. His books have been translated into 10 languages. Ann Bikle is a biologist and environmental planner whose writing has appeared in Nautilus, Natural History, Smithsonian, Fine Gardening, and Best Health. The couple are married and live in Seattle. Their work includes a trilogy of books about soil health, microbiomes, and farming, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, The Hidden Half of Nature, and Growing a Revolution. As I mentioned, I was lucky enough to be joined by my co-host, Dr. Jill Clapperton, in this discussion with the authors. So without further ado, here we go.
Hello.
Hey. Here
Hey.
we are.
Hello, Jill. Hello, Sarah.
Hi.
By the way, I love the name Tasting Terroir.
Oh, good.
I think that's really.
It took us a long time to get that trademark. We had to read it out.
I am so happy to welcome David Montgomery and Ann Bikle to our podcast. And if you haven't got their book, What Your Food Ate, you really should. It's just a great book. It has so much research and so many really accessible ways to understand, even if you're not a soil scientist, why the health of the soil matters to both the flavor and the health of your food. And I'm thrilled also that we have my co-host, Jill Clapperton. Dr. Jill Clapperton is joining in this discussion. And so we're excited to hear her discussion with them and just all around continuing to look at this topic. So to start out, I just wanted to ask Dave and Ann, the book is about, obviously what your food ate. And for meat eaters, I think that would make a lot of sense. Did the beef that you ate, did it eat grass or grain? But what's really striking and unknown to a lot of people is that your plants are eating food too. Everything that you eat is eating something else. And so how did you maybe decide to go on this journey and look at this topic and what were you hoping to find?
Big question.
Yeah. It's been kind of a long and interesting journey for us to get to the point where we were writing about what our food ate, and in particular, sort of how we raise our crops and livestock in terms of what that means in terms of what gets into our food. And we really started sort of looking at the degradation of the soil and what you lose when you degrade soil health and soil quality. Because I'm a geologist and as a biologist, and you put those two things together, and soil's kind of right in the natural boundary between those, so that these areas overlap with both of our interests. But we, in all honesty, started looking at the degradation end first, and then Ann's also a gardener, and we noticed in writing "Dirt: The Erosion of Civilizations," the first book we wrote on these topics, as I was writing that, Ann was restoring degraded land in our yard, literally turning around the problems that I was writing about in that. And so we wrote a book called The Hidden Half of Nature about the role of microbial life in soil fertility and soil health, and supporting the human microbiome's role in gut health as well. And then that led us to thinking about, if you could restore our yard using composting and mulching and tending the microbial life in the soil. What about on farms? And that led to writing Growing a Revolution. That whole setup led us to basically realize that, wow, the way we treat our land is actually impacting what's getting into our food in ways that the medical sciences regard as things that could either cultivate human health or undermine human health. And it's that last point that really led us to writing What Your Food Ate. So it's sort of the end of a long journey that Ann and I have been on. And that's not the end, it's the latest step on a long journey that we've been on.
It can't be the end. We're not at the end yet.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, that comment, Jill, right? Agriculture's been going on for 10,000 years, and here we are all these years later, and we still haven't really quite got our arms completely around how it is we ought to be farming if we want to get, the two basic things that we really want out of agriculture, which is a sufficient amount of food and food that is that contains the kinds of things that are, the leverage points and the critical key factors in human health. And, as we, write in great detail about in the book, that goes way beyond just this simple notion of, protein, fats, carbohydrates. I mean, fats are in there, but they're considerably more complicated than I think most people realize. And I think also maybe part of the journey for us, Sarah, is that it's just sort of like anything. When you begin to look into it, you come to realizations and you start putting, a story together. But maybe it's really only, when you get considerably into something that you kind of reach this tipping point of realizing how much you don't know about things. Because at first, it's pretty simple to learn the basics, to get, to get all, get yourself up on this foundation of basics about any given topic. But then the more then the nuance starts to creep in, and the gray and the vague and the murkiness, but also at the same time, clarity around, oh, okay, there's this noise on the side, but overall, there's this central thing that that is happening. And that's kind of where I felt like with What Your Food Ate, it really came into at least my thinking on this, that farming practices are just, I realized this before with the other books, but in a whole new way, farming practices are just so fundamental to human health. And we never talk about it other than in terms of sufficient number, of calories. So,
now, what's with that?
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you right there. That is a great talking point right there. What is with the calories? I mean, we need more than just calories. I mean, we make energy from real nutrition. So what's with us dealing with calories alone?
Yeah, we put far too much emphasis in the last 80 years of really agronomy or agriculture as a whole, just focusing on the calorie question. And of course, we need adequate calories to provide the energy to keep our bodies going. But your health does not depend on calories. Survival may depend on calories, but health depends on much more than calories. And it's that connection and sort of how to grow not just enough food to feed the world, but enough nutritious food to nourish the world that we really took our eyes off of, I think, as a collective, humanity's collective agricultural endeavor over the last 80 years or so. We got very good at growing very large harvests of very few things and didn't realize that we were undercutting, the amount of minerals that were in them, the amount of phytochemicals that were in them, the kinds of compounds that our bodies use to help maintain health, such that the point that now we would have to eat many more calories to get those same level of health benefits from all those other compounds. And that means we'd be eating too many calories, which was not good for those of us who have access to plenty of calories.
Yeah. I couldn't resist that point, because we've been talking about, what are these, what is the dietary intake? And how do we calculate that? And it's all based on calories. And I'm like, wait, no, calories? Like, but we need a certain amount of them, but, are we just talking about lipids? I mean, because, like, where does this come from? And it's been really interesting, this whole idea between nutrition and science and farming. I mean, it's like the whole thing is completely disconnected.
Yeah, and there's even some really interesting, and to me, odd definitions of nutrition in the nutritional sciences world that sort of leave out things that are, known to be important for human health, but that you can live just fine without. Right. So you don't need them to survive, but that if you have more of them, and I'm thinking of things like that, phytochemicals like beta carotene or the lycopene in tomatoes, things that have antioxidant or anti-inflammatory effects in our bodies once we consume them. And plants make them for their own purposes, but that are good for us in our food. And we've known for a long time that how we farm affects those levels. But we haven't really paid all that much attention in terms of the nutritional sciences at looking at that as an element of nutrition. And instead of focused on, what does it take to maintain life rather than maintain quality of life?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that these motifs that run through agriculture, which you put your finger on, Jill, like what's with our sort of sheer focus on just calories, which is about quantity, which is about yield, that whole idea has flowed over and poured into the nutrition world, where we're either thinking in terms of total caloric content, or we're thinking in terms of do we have adequate levels of vitamin C or calcium or this thing or that thing. And the whole sort of problem with that line of thinking is that it's easy to measure those individual things, but we still really don't have a great understanding of how does that all work together, and how does that work together in the infant body, the male body, the female body, the whatever body, through, the life history of a human being. And that's dynamic. That is ever changing from, especially early in life, right? You ask anyone with kids and it's like, well, I don't know. They weren't doing that last week, but they're doing that this week. And, it's some new behavior, some new growth phase, right?
I don't know what I should do.
Yeah. And so we got this idea that the human diet was solely about sort of, fuel and energy. Mm-hmm. And so nutritionists started talking about, well, yeah, that's what we need, because you need to grow from an infant into an adult. And that's energy. That's the fuel part. And somehow along the way, we lost sight and track of, especially in the Western world, about how important it is to support things at the cellular level in the human body, right? So, you get on in your decades, into your 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. And it's like, wow, we got some hardworking cells here, and they're building up a bunch of exhaust inside that cell. There's got to be cleanup crews. There's got to be ways of keeping that cell, functioning. So you got to be your cells need to be a lot more tidy, so to speak, about what they do inside the body. And so this is why phytochemicals and probably other compounds and molecules yet to be discovered, or that we know about, but we're not quite sure what they do, these anti-inflammatory effects and their effects to just keep our cells functioning normally. I mean, that's a huge part of health that is completely different from, but as important as sort of these energy aspects. And we sort of got stuck. It's like we got stuck in this recording, like, the days when you had vinyl and it's like, oh, the needle's stuck and you just keep
going round and round
and round. And so here we are, the vinyl, the needle is stuck in the agricultural vinyl of yield. And same with nutrition, calories. And it's like, wait a minute, all that biomass that is the human body, we got to take care of that somehow. And it's not through a bunch of carbohydrates.
I love that analogy with the exhaust building up. That was, I love that.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me too, you had a number of examples in the book about, even when you try to make up for like what's been lost with supplementation or with fiber or whatever, it still doesn't have the same effect. Like we've lost this idea of that we come from whole and we need whole. That, yes, you can take a fiber supplement if you're eating nothing but white bread or what, you've lost fiber here, so we'll take it back there. And it's the same amount of fiber, so it should all be good. And it's that very kind of mathematical chemistry kind of thinking. Like we can control all the components and just select whichever way, but it's really fascinating that it doesn't work that way, that there is a wholeness that has to be taken in order to get all the benefit, that it matters that you eat the fiber with the thing that it was supposed to be in.
Yeah, definitely. And just an example of that, I was reading something the other day, there's a lot of discussion in the grain world about, some people are like, don't ever eat wheat again or any grain because it has phytic acids or phytates. So these are a phytochemical. Mm-hmm. And it's considered, some people think, oh, they're toxic, you shouldn't eat those at all. And they bind up minerals. And so it's really they call them anti-nutrients. And it's like, wait a minute. That's a pretty extreme way of looking at a crop that has fed humanity for thousands of years. And okay, some phytates might bind up some mineral to some extent, but it's not binding up 100% of the iron in a wheat grain, or 100% of the selenium or the calcium or what have you. And so it's just these ways that human beings are so interesting. It's like either we just sort of get addicted to thinking in terms of black and white things, mm-hmm. or we get stuck in the vague and the gray. And so then we say, well, we can't say anything. And it's like, no, wait a minute here. We can navigate our way through that situation. And so, and some of these phytates, I think, are probably doing things in our bodies that we're completely unaware of. And that, there might be, and they might be a mix of detrimental and beneficial, but like on the whole, so back to your point, Sarah, on the whole, these things are an important food to have as a part of the human diet.
Yeah. And Jill, I'd love you to chime in. And I mean, I know you know this too from your work and your research.
Well, I was going to chime in on the whole.
Yeah.
So, I sort of I've been through the book a couple of times. And one thing that really struck me was historically speaking. And that was going through like Alfred Howard and Yves Balfour, André Voisin, Anna Primavesi was another one that came to mind for me from Brazil. People who were so far ahead of their time. And so one of the questions I'd ask is, you really dove into this, Anne and Dave, is that they tried to turn the tanker around. Mm-hmm. And so why didn't they succeed, and how will we, given what you dove into?
The take I would have on that is that what people like Howard and Balfour and others in their era back in the 30s and 40s, and McCarrison ahead of before them,
right?
What they were all looking at and doing is they're running experiments, they're making observations, they're putting together a story about how the way we treated land or fed our crops influenced what got into the nutrition, whether they're feeding it to rats or cows or people. But they had a very different, so they had observations and anecdotes and connections to point out. But what they really lacked was much in the way of a scientific underpinnings for a mechanism. And so it was really hard for them to sell their unlike-minded conventional peers that they were actually seeing very real things and seeing real effects. Because at the time, people are enamored with the higher yields you could get from adding a lot of fertilizer to degraded land, and then kind of swept under the rug that, that meant that you then had to start using a lot of pesticides because, something happened and there were now more pests in those fields. And, it was that progress can be very effective blinders when one defines progress in a particular way and just ignores any evidence that might challenge that wisdom. So what I think that they really lacked in that day was one of the things they lacked was the ability to point to specific mechanisms they could independently verify, and other scientists could go, oh, yes, this is actually the way it works. And part of that was because our understanding of the microbial world in soil was truly embryonic in those days. There was hardly any understanding that there were even beneficial organisms in the soil, let alone that it was teeming with them in healthy, fertile soil, and as a key part of the basis for fertility and nutrient cycling. So one of the things we tried to do in the book is to lay out what the last 80 years of science has really filled in terms of connecting the dots, going between the way that farmers treat the soil to the health of the soil, from the health of the soil to the health of crops, to the health of crops and plants, and what livestock eats to livestock health, and how that all rolls up into human health. And that's a lot of dots to connect, right? Going from soil health all the way over to human health. But if you break it into bite-sized pieces, you can kind of connect the path all the way there. Even if it's going to be a long time before someone does the definitive experiment at a population level, sort of showing with 99% certainty about how all the connections work. But there's studies that have done a lot of that for all the little pieces. So that's a big part of what we tried to do, is to basically go back to look at some of those insights from historical figures and investigate, what have we learned since then? And, they come out looking pretty good in hindsight as people who are kind of ahead of their time, because their insights were really pointing in the direction that I think science has led in the subsequent century.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I love that title, Rocks Become You.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just so you, Dave. Like I could see the geologist in that, and how it just sort of, started really flowing from, well, here's how we mineralize rocks. And that whole discussion of how we mineralize rocks is really powerful, because that really the bedrock, the start of the whole situation, how we started to actually get trace elements into our food, right?
Yeah.
And then how do we go on that? So one of the things I also wanted to ask you, given that you've talked about you've really looked at these things in individual studies all along, is now as scientists, where are the gaps? And how do we as scientists start to approach those gaps in a meaningful way?
I think one of the biggest gaps that we sort of saw in the literature that we reviewed for the book, and if anyone's interested in the science and the background that we're talking about here, we also actually published the source list from the book as a separate PDF document that you can download from our website, digtogrow.com. It's free. Norton basically published it as a free ebook. It's a PDF. People shouldn't have to go looking for all these sources again. We've swept them into a big pile, and you can sort through them on your own if you'd like to. And now I forgot your question.
Well, yeah. So your question was about gaps. Where are the gaps?
Oh, right.
Stuff,
Yeah.
Jill. And I think you can think about that. But what comes to my mind in part is that we know some of the mechanisms, and we know some of the connections between the way that, say, high levels of organic matter and minimal chemical and physical disturbance of the soil translate into nutrient density in crops. I think we need to explore that more, because at least this is how my mind works. The more evidence that you can get behind something and then write and communicate about to the people that information is going to impact, you're just sort of building your case over and over again, or you're at least adding to it so that it gets to the point that, look, this is pretty rock solid, what we've got going here. And when you have that kind of an evidence base for anything in science, for that matter, that's what can, I think, start to turn this ship around, is just continually adding to the evidence base, because then, anywhere from farmers to policymakers to consumers to food companies, they're kind of like, you want to get people to that point of, I guess the writing's on the wall. I guess this is how it is.
Yeah.
And so, once
there's a real frustration though, because regenerative agriculture as a title, as a term, has been trying to kind of move people in that direction, not maybe all of, but that's really what you're talking about, in the book, and the farmers that you're interviewing and profiling. And marketing has taken over, and there's so much confusion now about what it is. And so as I was thinking about, because I come from a policy world, and I know all the ins and outs of how hard that is to change policy because of all the things that are behind that. And so why you would like to see that change. I'm wondering if maybe part of the solution is that people really need to have a garden, even if it's just a salad pot in there, which I have 3 in my windowsill, and start doing on a micro level the practices that you talk about in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, because then when you taste that green, when you snip the little lettuce or the arugula or whatever it is you're growing, and you taste the difference, you taste how much more peppery, and how, just the real difference of what you've done versus what you buy in the store. Right. That, because I feel like there's got to be a way for people to experience it and not just read about it.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to get any argument from this gardener about growing any kind of plant. I don't care if you want to eat it or look at it. You just got to marvel at it. Okay. Yeah. And I think you can marvel at whatever, your house plant, all the way to your corn plant, to your whatever. But that is a really good point, Sarah. And it goes to, tasting terroir, what you guys call this podcast, because the body knows when it's taking in what it needs. And one of the most fascinating areas that we researched for the book was this whole link between nutrient density and flavor, and that flavor is coding. Embedded in that flavor are things like phytochemicals and particular amino acids and a particular fat profile. I mean, that's what all this tomato research out of, I think it's
Florida somewhere.
Yeah, out of Florida, Harry Clay. That's what it's telling us, is that flavor links to health. And if you're perturbing and you're sort of jamming monkey wrenches in at the level of the soil with all these practices, all you're doing is you're getting in the way of biology, and you don't want to do that. You want to let these plants function biologically like they're supposed to be doing, so that all of this then, eventually accrues to these nutrient dense foods in the human diet.
And you know what? You can do that if you put your plant hat on and become a plant. If you're feeling good and you have enough nutrition, and you don't have a lot of pests, actually nibbling at you or poking you all the time, you can actually put a lot of nutrition into your body. And you can use the energy at that point. You're not expending it to build up lignin to keep something off you, or using in the chemic acid pathway to make all these really toxic chemicals. You can actually use it to actually add in all these trace elements, add in all these other things. And I don't think that's any different than us. If we're really healthy and our gut's really healthy, we can take in a lot more nutrients.
That is a great analogy, Jill.
Yeah.
I love it. I'm going to be thinking about my plant hat. All these things coming out of it and going into it. I love it.
I'm going to have to create one like Harry Potter, only it's going to be the plant hat, right? You're going to put it on and you're going to be able to think about how you sort plants. I don't know.
Totally.
Well, I love that you did spend so much time on that link between flavor and health, because that is what we're trying to get at. But so often when we talk to people, they'll be like, well, I think so, but I don't know. Well, we don't know. And I'm like, they found a lot of science behind, which intuitively makes sense. It makes sense that when you taste a really good tomato, that it's because it has more nutrients in it.
I think Anne was the one who first sort of between us started digging up papers that looked at, how there's taste receptors throughout the organs of the human body that tie into what when we taste them in our mouths, we call flavors, but that they're really sort of sensory receptors to what's in our food. And when you think evolutionarily about, think in the days of before food processing, say when we were mostly hunting and gathering, it would make sense that the foods that our bodies needed would be foods that tasted good, that there'd be a positive feedback, that people that ate healthy food were healthier and had more progeny and then were better represented in future generations. It just makes very simple evolutionary sense, all the way through to the point when we really started to do like massive food processing and changing things, taking whole foods, breaking them into their components, and then remixing them in ways that broke the link between flavor and what's actually in food. And that makes it, I think, very challenging for us today to really kind of appreciate that and understand it. But we've all had the experience of eating those flavorless tomatoes that you can occasionally buy at the grocery store, or having that absolutely delicious heirloom tomato that somebody you knew grew in their yard that kind of melts in your mouth and you go like, my God, this is what tomato is supposed to taste like. And that applies to all kinds of foods in terms of fresh whole foods. So there hasn't been a huge evidentiary basis. And one of the things I think we were a bit surprised by is that there's not a lot of studies that make that connection. The ones that do are pretty clear. But there's a lot of, back to your question of sort of what are the gaps and what's needed. I mean, there's more interest, I think, in the terroir beyond wine is how I like to think about it. That food has a terroir and that it relates to flavor. And terroir is a big complicated concept that integrates everything from the atmosphere to the soils, to the weather, to the microbes and the life in the soil. But, it may be that all of that actually really does impact what gets in our food, and how we farm impacts, all that at one scale or another.
Absolutely. I mean, I think back to this, and that's how you and I met.
Yeah.
In person was sitting on that panel that was mediated by Dan Barber.
Oh, right.
And
absolutely.
And we were talking about taste, and can you measure taste, and can you, and if something tastes good, is it really good for you? Because intuitively we believe that. I mean, and to your point, that gap, that is a serious gap in the literature, because linking that idea of taste, because taste and aroma and these things are all more like a social science, because they're so subjective, like whether you have those inadequate sensory organs, or whether you don't, how you taste flavor. And then not all of us need the same things, as you pointed out earlier, right? Like, and at certain stages in our life, or certain stages of the day, or whatever our stages of health are, we need different things. And so we might, just as a pregnant woman might want fermented foods because of them, maybe it's because of the microbiology. We don't know right now. I mean, that's the whole point, is that we don't really understand that. I know in the lab right now, I've been playing with volatiles and using headspace analysis to actually look at, well, what do we smell? But the thing that is most interesting to me is that all of those things, I can buy them separately. Like when I started to look at that, I thought, oh, that's amazing. Look at that aldehyde. Look at this. Look at this. And then I realized that they were all for sale. And you can add them all in. How you want. And I was flabbergasted. I really was. I was like, there's nothing new here, Jill.
Well, so is what you're saying, Jill, so then if you can buy all of these volatiles, like somewhere in the food industry, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Then why grow them? Well, here's why. Here's why, girl. Because there's as good as any food industry chemist might be, I don't believe that they truly understand the proportions and the particular, variant of a phytochemical that goes into the flavor profile that the human body goes, oh yeah, that I'm hankering for more of that. Food industry, great. They'll just shove sugar and salt into something and the human being will eat it. And that's a totally, that's tapping totally different kinds of levers. And I thought that's what you meant, Jill. And it reminded me of something that is kind of, happening right now around. So the millennials and the Gen Zers are sort of down on alcohol these days. And so there's, dry October, dry January, and and we are in the modern era though, and you need to drink something, right?
Yes.
So instead of just drinking water, the food industry, whomp, are they ever onto this? Aha, mocktails,
Yes.
beer and wine with no alcohol. Okay, fine. Or if you want to drink soda pop, you can drink that. And then, so I was thinking about this, and I was over the summer, I was sitting having dinner somewhere. This happened to be in Maine, and the only place they had a seat was at the bar. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'll sit at the bar. So of course, what do I start doing? Oh, here, can I sit? Let me take a look at that label on your bitters thing. And oh, what's in that gin? And it's all sitting there. And it's like, I'm kind of bored. I'm like, oh, just reading the labels on all this stuff. And what was really interesting to me on the orange little container called orange bitters, I'm expecting to see
Orange.
Exactly. There was not one genuine citrus derived ingredient in that stuff. It was phenyloxyl this, benzyl that. The whole thing was a big chemical cocktail, which, okay, maybe some of those volatiles truly came out of a citrus, but not in the proportion and combination and so forth that you'd actually find it. So in other words, this is all, they're just kind of hijacking and jerking around our body wisdom with all of these flavorings that are going into all of these non-alcoholic things, which I would like the Gen Zers and millennials to know. I mean, why can't we make wine instead of 15% alcohol content? Great, let's get it down to 11 or 12%. Why do you think the French for so long have been able to, drink a bottle of wine at lunch? Well, because it's not 15% alcohol that leaves you on your face.
But there's that abundance, isn't it? More.
Oh,
more. If I can have this little bit, why not have more? I can create something that's more. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, and you put that in, you talk about that in your book about more. And I certainly see it, but I think the point that we talked about earlier about the whole is really important, because we don't understand, and you made this point too, we don't understand what all these phytochemicals do. Do they help us take up other nutrients? What are the helper molecules?
Yeah.
Like when we eat whole foods, where are the helpers? Well, we don't even know what the helpers are, but I think back to mycorrhizal fungi, and there are helper bacteria that, you can't actually have colonization unless I have this microbial community around the root in order to help stimulate that change. And I think that our guts and a lot of other things work that way. We need whole foods. We need whole plant extracts. We need this wholeness in order to get all the nutrients we need, because otherwise, if we're just cobbling them all together in what we think is good for us, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're sort of missing the potential of and the potential ubiquity of synergistic effects, where it's not so much the individual elements, but the combinations that we take them up in that matter. And, and that's where there's another gap on the agronomic end of things, in that if you look at most of the studies that have looked at the kind of things that we wrote about or tried to connect in the book, most of them will try and look at singular practices. They'll study like no-till farming, or they'll study cover cropping. When from everything that I can triangulate from this whole series of books that we've worked on, is it's the system of farming that matters, not so much individual practices, but the net effect of a combined system of practices. And so that if you want to look at regenerative agriculture in particular, you wouldn't just go compile studies on no-till, for example, because you're going to find, because that's not the same story as if you're doing some kind of minimal chemical and physical disturbance with maximum diversity and continual cover, either between crops, between rows, or between crops in a sequence of crops. And you really can't find very many published systems level studies that involve all those practices compared against the full suite of conventional practices. Everybody breaks it down into comparing one practice at a time. Why? Well, it's easier to fund. You can get one student to do it. You can actually get a clear result. It gives you a nice testable hypothesis, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're asking the right question. And I think that that's something that the agronomic world has fallen down, very much in the last few decades, is trying to wrestle with the issues in terms of what questions to ask and what studies to do to address systems level differences. Because that's where, we actually, in the parsing of the literature that we've done now in a few books looking at that, that's where we tend to see really big effects, or when people completely shift the nature of the system and adopt a suite of practices that are different than conventional. Then you get these synergistic effects that are quite remarkable in relatively short periods of time.
And that's why the mindset, that's how the regenerative farmers we talk to, they all talk about it as a mindset rather than practices, and that practices change and they'll swap out things as new problems emerge or as weather changes, but it's the mindset that is the most important thing. And so what's been really hard is to try to convey that, to consumers. Of course, you need to then know the farmer to understand what their mindset was. And, our system isn't built for that. So do you think part of what is involved in people eating better is to actually find and support those people that are actually growing it and selling it directly to you?
I mean, in terms of, avenues within the marketplace today, that's probably a consumer's best avenue towards trying to get to the best food, because you can sort of then peer through the labels, whatever they are that those farmers are adopting. And if you can know what they're actually doing, it gives you greater insight,
especially if they've read your book, and then they can ask.
Oh, right. There's that first step.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, there is an educational piece that's a big. I mean, we aren't taught this. I mean, we should be. This should be part of what we learn in high school. Health and what makes up health.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was in high school, you had these lousy, of course, the girls had to go to home economics and the boys got to go off to wood shop. And I always wanted to go to wood shop, partly because you're kidding me. In home economics, I'm going to open up this box of stuff, mix in some water and put this thing in the oven. That is not creative. That is really boring. And it tastes like crap. So get me out of here. Right. So this is what home economics, we could call it, maybe it's just lifestyle school, but you're absolutely right, Sarah. What that kind of a course and content ought to be about in high school is, your food, how your body works, how we're growing that food, and how that all comes together over a lifetime. I mean, if you told a kindergartner could get that at a very, kind of basic, simplistic level. And if we started, I feel like, younger if we started earlier in our education system with making links between how we farm, to Dave's point, the whole farming system, not any one practice, and how that ripples through to the plants and the animals. And we could call them plants and animals. I'm kind of about full disclosure. We're eating living beings, whether they're green or brown and furry, right? That's the deal, plant and animal foods. And we would just have a lot more honesty in our food system. And I think we'd have a lot more honesty about what it is we need to change and what it is we need to keep about the way we approach agriculture and farming in the US, which is about your mindset. I'd love to see these kinds of things come out in the mindset of a farmer, or have them thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, it would also make people less susceptible to some of these claims that another area that you talked about a lot in the book that I just loved was like the fake meat, the ultra processing that goes. I mean, if people saw, instead of fake beef or whatever, impossible beef or whatever, if they saw it as ultra processed food.
Yeah, because that's what it is.
Because that's what it is. But it changes the whole mindset of what you're doing, because they think many people think they're eating healthier because they're avoiding meat. And to share with the people what.
And really what the first question that ought to be asked, if one wants to eat healthier, I think prior to the question of, do I eat meat or do I eat plants, the way it's usually framed, would be, how is whatever I'm eating raised?
Yes.
What did your food eat? How was it grown? Because we can point to examples of livestock being very integral tools in landscape rejuvenation and increased carbon sequestration on degraded grazing lands in ways that also provide, more omega-3 rich foods for human consumption, foods that are better at quelling inflammation than the omega-6 rich meat and dairy that comes off of feedlots, where they're primarily fed seed derived feeds, which are going to be very rich in omega-6s, which tend to promote inflammation when they carry through into the human body. So, and similarly with plant-based foods, if they're grown regeneratively, a vegan diet, that's great. It could be completely healthy. You got to watch out a little bit for, certain nutrients that you might want to have pay special attention to getting if you're very strict about it. But if you're eating plant-based foods that were derived with farming practices that degrade the land to the point that the mycorrhizal connections with crops aren't there, you'll be getting fewer minerals, you'll be getting fewer phytochemicals. Sure, you'll be eating plants, but you may not be eating as healthy as you could on a different plant-based diet.
And so here's where we depart. So
do we not agree on everything?
Well,
apparently not.
This is what I find kind of irritating and intriguing all at the same time. And it's the cleverness of the term plant-based meat. Because last time I checked, animals that are herbivores, that's all they eat. That's why they're an herbivore.
So it is plant-based.
They are plant-based. Yeah.
Exactly. So all of our ruminants are plant-based meat because
so great.
That's what they eat. And especially, with the exception of feedlot practices. And we're not in that.
Let's not go into
We're not in that realm on this podcast, and it's not worth talking about that.
Yeah.
But all of these, pasture raised herbivores, that is what they're eating. They're eating plants, and that is plant-based meat. Somehow the food industry got a hold of plant-based meat and turned it into this. They missed the labels, Sarah. They already have plant-based meat.
Yeah.
That's dairy and beef. And, goat.
And they don't fully disclose the amount of sodium chloride that's in it.
Right. And that other stuff is UPF. These are ultra processed foods. It's really very, it's kind of stunning in the way in which it's interpreted and presented to the consumer. Quite stunning, actually.
No, it has been, especially because there's almost like a virtuous glow that people seem to feel about it when it's exactly the opposite.
Well, it's more nuanced and complicated than an either or, and that's where I go back to my point of it's important whether you're going to be interested in eating meat as part of your diet or dairy as part of your diet or not. It's a very personal choice for people.
Sure.
But if people are making it from the perspective of trying to have a smaller environmental footprint for their diet and have a stronger health footprint personally for them or their loved ones that they're feeding, then whichever kind of diet they're on, they need to ask the question of, well, how was it raised? And that's the virtuous glow that often surrounds the perhaps incorrectly named plant-based meat proponents. It really goes back to, there's lots of that. The first book that we wrote on this, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. I mean, almost every civilization I wrote about in that book as having destroyed their land and impoverished their descendants for centuries after the fact, did it with organic agriculture. Yeah. And they did it by degrading the land. And they did it mostly with plant-based foods.
Yeah.
And so it's really how you treat the land that I think is the common denominator for how we ought to be thinking about the way that our environmental footprint of our diet, our global footprint of our diets, and the human health impact of our diets. And the framing that I think we could take across the board, whether we're talking about crops or livestock, is to rethink about farming, to reevaluate farming practices in terms of their net effect on soil health. And soil health is, it's a bit of a squishy concept, but so is human health. We don't have a crisp definition of human health that you can go out and get a number and measure and go, my health score is this, yours is that. I mean, we have lots of specialties in terms of different maladies. And I think soil health is kind of similar. It's a very useful overarching concept that we tend to recognize most by its absence, just the way that we recognize human health most by its absence. We know when we're sick. When we feel good, we just feel good. We tend not to pay attention to feeling good. We just feel good. And I think that we could, if we started looking at the land similarly, the first thing we'd come away with is like, good Lord, most of the world's farmland is sick and not healthy. How do we turn that around? And that's, to me, the common denominator that underpins regenerative agriculture, and all it sort of stands for, and the promise of it is a way to think about farming that leaves the land better off as a consequence of how we farm. And that's certainly not conventional farming today.
Right.
I couldn't agree more. But before you go, I want to read one part from your book. When desperate people pass their suffering to the land, degraded soil hands impoverishment right back. There is a compelling need for a global shift in how we see soil, to accept the health of the land as central to our own. I thought that was one of the most powerful statements I've ever heard. I have to tell you that. It almost brought me to tears when I read it, because, and so when I think about that, once again, I come back to, what is regenerative ag and how do we turn this around? Because I personally feel a desperate need to do that.
I think a lot of us are desperate like that. We're getting it, right? And we've been seeing what has been happening to land and to human health for a while. And it's clear, like, we do need to change things. And you'd asked a little earlier about so what can we do to turn this ship around? And why weren't, historically, the Balfours and Howards and others and other cultures able to do this? And I think these days, one way to consider going about this is it's a concerted, coordinated, long-term effort. And I think it begins with raising awareness and knowledge, which is where, writers like us come in, and providing information in a way that's, as you put it, it's assimilatable. Picture plants sucking up information. Well, it's our farmers, our eaters, our chefs, everybody. So that's where we come in. You raise awareness and knowledge, and then you find out, you actually talk to farmers and you say, hey, what are your challenges and barriers? Because life is too hard. Farming is too hard for anybody to take on something with insurmountable or even medium-sized barriers. That might be technical knowledge. That might be money. That might be incentives. Say, okay, now we've got a handle on your barriers and challenges. Then what do? You work to remove them. Right? You want somebody to take 10,000 steps a day, then give them a decent pair of shoes, give them some time, give them a walking route, right? We need that kind of an idea applied to farmers if we want them to go regen. And then once you've the education and information there, we understand the challenges are on their way out. We need to nest that in a cocoon of support. And that's how you keep people doing things. You get the pivot happening, and then you support it. And that support piece is it's private sector, it's government, it's how we spend our food dollars, all of that. Nothing needs to be invented, Jill, to make this change, right? We don't need to make some carbon sucking machine that's going to send this stuff off to Mars. We already have all of the infrastructure. We have the human know-how. We have a civil society that can, interact productively around these things. That's how we do it.
And we have a lot of farmers who already do this.
Yeah. And we can lean on them.
So many people think that there's nobody out there doing this. And there are a lot of farmers that got this.
It's the processing industry.
But
we've talked about that in other episodes. Yes. Well, we could talk to you for another whole hour. So, as we wrap up, do please answer the question that Jill mentioned. We do ask everybody. So we just say, what is regenerative agriculture? Fill in the blank. Regenerative agriculture is when you farm in ways that bring life back to the soil. If it's kind of short on life in the first place, or if you got pretty decent soil,
your practices are just continually improving and replenishing that so that biology is functioning normally, which is to say exactly how it's supposed to be functioning between the fungi, the bacteria, the metabolites, and everything.
Yeah, and I would say what she said. Regenerative agriculture is a style of intensive farming that can leave the soil healthier and better off than without. So, farming that can improve soil health, and it's
great.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. What she said.
What you both said. We'll just say combine it together. What Ann and Dave said.
And I just would want to say, though, to your point about the solution, the pathway, I think that's an excellent one. And that's, that is what Jill does in her work with farmers all the time. I mean, she just helps farmers understand the different practices specific to their land. And, because all their situations are different. And so, and there are other advisors like Jill, working with farmers. And so that knowledge, getting that knowledge out and getting the awareness that there are people like that can help farmers solve those problems is a big piece too.
It's actionable. We talked about that today with Francis Yateman. It was like, it's about actionable results. Like, don't just hand somebody a bunch of numbers and go, here you go.
Right.
Like, right. And then they look at you and they go, so, what am I supposed to do with this? Like,
exactly.
Does this mean anything? Does this tell me where I am in the scheme of things? And back to your point, Anne, is about grabbing somebody by the hand. You have to succeed to turn things around. You have to succeed at the very first step. You have to. And everyone can. Everybody can take a first step. And then it's working through all the other steps. And just me handing you a bunch of numbers is not going to solve the problem. There's a whole lot of other things and all those synergistic effects and all those other things that come into play that are going to solve this. But I want to thank you for your book. Thank you so much for putting all this together and all your books. I know the enormous amount of research that you both did on this. And I can't thank you enough for putting it together in a very digestible form where my microbiome doesn't have to work very hard to understand it.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate, that coming from you, Jill, is just really special because you do understand the amount of work that goes into researching this topic. So that personally, that means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I want you to keep going. So I will do what I can to keep those books coming because, it's such a breath of fresh air to have people who do a really thorough job, who really really weave the science into this incredible language that's so easy, and the analogies and the metaphors and everything. It's really nice. So congratulations on this book. I mean it because I know how much hard work went in, and please keep it up.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's worth a lot. Yeah. Maybe we'll give you a call every 6 months. Jill, we need a little pat on the shoulder here. Keep us going.
I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it. And I would love to take you through the lab and show you what we're doing and talk about it. And
we can wear our green hats and we can think like a plant.
We'll wear our plant hats.
Okay, good.
I promise.
Good.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jill.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
You've been listening to Tasting Terroir, a podcast made possible by a magical collaboration between the following companies and supporters, all working together to help farmers, chefs, food companies, and consumers to build healthier soil for a healthier world. Rhizoterra. Owned by Dr. Jill Clapperton, Rhizoterra is an international food security consulting company providing expert guidance for creating healthy soils that yield tasty, nutrient-dense foods. Check us out at rhizoterra.com. That's RHIZOTERRA.com. counterparts.com. And the Global Food and Farm online community, an ad-free global social network and soil health streaming service that provides information and connections that help you apply the science and practice of improving soil health. Join us at globalfoodandfarm.com. And from listeners like you who support us through our Patreon account at patreon.com/tastingterroir. Patrons receive access to our full-length interviews and selected additional materials. Patrons will also have the opportunity to submit questions that we will answer on the podcast. Tune in next week to hear more interviews and insights with myself, Sarah Harper, and Dr. Jill Clapperton, as well as the regenerative farmers, chefs, and emerging food companies in the Global Food and Farm online community and beyond. If you like our work, please give us a 5-star rating and share the podcast with your friends. Thanks so much for listening and for helping us get the word out about this new resource to taste the health of your food. Until next week, stay curious, keep improving, and don't stop believing that better is possible when knowledge is available.